C.N.E. Corbin, a PhD candidate at UC Berkeley and a member of the Graduate Fellows Program, would sponsor today's event. The Graduate Fellows Program is an interdisciplinary training program to support social change scholarship and diversity in the academy. As a group, we chose Professor John Jennings to be our featured speaker this year. So we're so glad that he agreed to do this virtual event with us, and we're going to get to that in a minute. First, I want to announce that we're currently fundraising to provide stipends for our students who will be Graduate Fellow Program next year. And there's a link in the YouTube chat for those who are able to give during this difficult time. I want to thank our sponsors for this event, the Other and Belonging Institute, the Townsend Center for Humanities, the Department of English, and the Center for Research on Social Change. The format of today's event is after I introduce him, Professor John Jennings, he's gonna talk about his work with us. Then we're gonna have a Q&A moderated by one of my colleagues, Fantasia Painter, and myself. If you have a question, please put it in the YouTube chat and we'll be collecting those questions and asking them on your behalf. And now it's my pleasure to introduce John Jennings, Professor of Media and Culture Studies at UC Riverside. Professor Jennings has been a key figure in the archiving, creating, and cultivating of Black popular culture in graphic novels, illustrated fiction, and graphic design. Jennings has contributed to creating a foundation of theory, community, and mentorship that has led to what has been called the Black Speculative Arts Movement. His work has helped give a visual aesthetic to Afrofuturism. He is the author, editor, and/or illustrator of many award-winning publications. I'm especially excited about his illustrations for the graphic novel adaptations of Octavia E. Butler's groundbreaking books, Kindred and Parable of the Sower. Welcome, Professor Jennings.
Hello. Sorry, I had to unmute myself there. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. And I'm going to go ahead and set my timer because, as I stated earlier, I'm a rambler. So I'm going to do that now. I'm very, very grateful to be here. And I'm going to go ahead and start my screen share. Let's see here. Still learning how to Zoom properly here. Oh, there it is. Okay. So it's always difficult doing these kinds of talks because I've been in the academy for like 20 years. And in my previous life, I was a graphic design professor. So I tend to have to take different portions of a lot of the work that I've done. So this is gonna be kind of like a really cursory overview of a lot of different things that I've gotten into over the last decade or so in different areas. And I thought that the title Cyborgs and Crossroads kind of gives two different parts of this intersection. A lot of the talk is about like just the idea of hybridity or like interdisciplinarity, really trying to push against different kind of normative ways of looking at scholarship. Call myself a critical maker. I mean, I go through a lot of the same research processes, but I'll end up creating something that is, that is an actual project, a product of some kind that is used as in a discursive way. And I'll talk about that in a second. One of the things I want to talk about is the fact that my son Jackson is 10 months old today. Yay, Jackson. This is him actually popping out of this Black Comics Returns book that Damien Duffy and I did, which is a collection of African-American independent comic artists. The reason why I want to start with Jackson is because of his name, right? So it's not spelled the traditional way for a very important reason. So Jackson's named after Jackson State University, where I went to undergrad, which is a historically Black college in my home state of Mississippi. He's also kind of named after me too, because Jack is also the familiar term for John. So he's Jack's son. He's also, his middle name is Kirby. So his name is Jackson Kirby. So he's definitely named after Jack Kirby. And if you're a comic geek, then you realize that, Jack Kirby co-created the X-Men, Captain America, Thor, all of these different Marvel movies that are, these Marvel characters that have come out. But the other thing is like he's named after my my late grandfather, Albert. I came up in a very agrarian, financially challenged, post-civil rights era Mississippi, and I was raised by my grandparents. And I feel like that my grandfather Albert was like the first superhero that I ever met, right? And I just totally loved Albert Thompson. That was his name. But you wouldn't know that because he signed his name with an X, because he was illiterate. He could not read or write, right? And even though he valued education for me and my sister, he made a lot of sacrifices early on in his life. And he felt, I think, that that he didn't have a chance to actually go to school and things of that nature. So we kind of like used that X in the middle of Jackson's name to kind of like talk about Albert, my grandfather. But the other thing that is really interesting about the X is that it's a lot of different things, right? It's a crossroads. It's also the number 10, right? It's also solving for the unknown. All the interesting things lie in the middle. You know, that's why a lot of towns start around crossroads and intersections, right? The West African people or just people from the African diaspora have a god or several gods dedicated to the crossroads, right? Eshualegua, Exu, Carrefour, different representations of the idea of the crossroads, because a lot of times the more interesting things lie with those intersections. And I think that after quite a while in the academy, I think that a lot of times we're very siloed up, you know, and a lot of times that siloing, it really hinders us from doing like really constructive, interdisciplinary work, right? It's funny because when I think about the term interdisciplinarity, I think like, well, that's actually how people learn, right? You don't necessarily start on like a track, you know, you actually kind of stumble across things. And it's almost like in some ways, you know, the academy gives us an unnatural way of learning to a certain degree. And even though I love teaching and I love, you know, what my colleagues have done over, you know, in those particular areas, but it's almost like these two silos should cross more, you know? That's how we get Reese's Pieces, you know, chocolate and peanut butter. They intersect, right? That's delicious. Anyway, let me keep going. See, I told you I ramble. Anyway, I always go back to these particular pieces, right? This is from a series of images called Matters of the Fact, and these were created in 2008. And it's around the first time that I heard the term Afrofuturism. I did these for a fellowship that I had at James Madison University, and I was really into technoculture or Japanese technoculture at the time. I think I had just reread Donna Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto. And I was also thinking about like Frantz Fanon's work as well too, particularly the fact of blackness from Black Skin, White Mass. And so part of this fellowship is we had to create these art pieces or something of some type of show, you know. So we would go to James Madison University, you teach for like 2 weeks there, you hang out there with their students, and then you come back the following year for an exhibition of some kind. And instead of doing a retrospective, I wanted to do new pieces. And so I was thinking about the ideas around like stereotyping and the notions of fixity, you know, and I always mention this, that the word stereotypes comes from the Greek term stereos, which means hard or fixed, right? So I'm thinking about the idea that the constructed Black identity is this kind of hard, fixed, you know, mechanized thing that we're kind of enforced, that we kind of pushed into, right? And so the fleshy part of the cyborg, what you're seeing, is how we see ourselves. So it's almost like a cyberpunk extrapolation of like double consciousness, maybe, you know. But the other thing too, and knows about stereotypes, is that they're constructed. They actually are really well designed, and they function in a particular way. They don't just pop out of the ground like daisies. They're actually extremely well thought out, and they have particular functions, right? So that was something else I thought about too. Whether it's you know, Buck, you know, angry Black man, thug, what have you. You know, it's the same construction. It's the same. It just kind of changed the brand name. So I ended up making like 70 or so of these things that were really based off of like images that you've seen throughout Black history, but also fused with this kind of like, you know, this technological weirdness to it. And I actually sat down over a 4-day period. I made these digitally over, it's like 72 images or something like that. And I felt like, you know, that I was meant to make them. They kind of flowed through me. And I always start with them because it was the first time I came across the term Afrofuturism, because my friend Dana Rush, who's an Africanist, she looked at them and she was like, these look really Afrofuturist. And I'm like, whoa, I don't know what that is, but thank you, you know. And so I actually started doing research, and I realized, like, yes, if you look at like Mark Derry's original definition of Afrofuturism, this notion of like, you know, race, representation, technoculture, you know, and cybernetic imagery, right? Um, they do fall into that category. So I started becoming really interested in Black speculative fiction at that point. And this is around the same time that, you know, a lot of people started becoming interested in that particular subject matter. Me and my friend Ronaldo Anderson, who is now over the Black Speculative Arts Movement pop-up symposia that have become like an international phenomenon, we actually ended up speaking at the Sorbonne, part of this UNESCO event. And we spoke about Afrofuturism. And from then on, we started collaborating quite a bit. And before you know it, we actually started pulling together different events and working on, you know, co-written pieces together. I started like really getting into this notion of like how the Black body gets, the fungibility of the Black body, and how the components of it kind of function in slavery or just in like, you know, popular culture. Yeah, because like some of these pieces, like I talk about the idea that, you know, the slave body, you really only focused on the part of the body that you needed. Like for instance, the back, you know, or if you're looking at someone who's working as a house slave, then the hands are the only thing that you really need, that kind of thing, right? So, and how all these different components were replaceable and fungible and interchangeable, right? And so that kind of started me down this path to think about like the notions of hybridity, of like pastiche. I was already doing a lot of research on hip hop as well, because that was something that I was really into, as well as this notion of remix and bricolage. And I was teaching a class called the visual culture of hip hop as a design studio. It's probably the first hip hop design studio, you know, if I could, you know, if I'm doing my research properly, probably in the country. And I was at the University of Illinois at the time. And that particular class, along with these notions of like speculation and around sampling and remixing and using digital tools, you know, more, I don't know, I guess in this really kind of brazen way to kind of make these logos for people, so to speak, you know. Yeah, so those are some of the pieces that I was thinking about. So this particular slide comes from John Akomfra's groundbreaking film, The Last Angel of History, which really is a documentary. It's about 44 minutes, came out in like 1997. So that's 4 years after the term Afrofuturism is introduced into like, you know, the academy. And so Akomfra uses this trope called the data thief, which I'm totally obsessed with. A time-traveling archaeologist that's trying to piece together Black culture throughout the detritus of time itself. So this, you know, this kind of time traveling back and forth, and basically comes up with this. There's a scene, actually. You can go to YouTube and check out the trailer, and he has this character, the data thief, at a crossroads, right? He's at a crossroads, and he's talking about the legend of Robert Johnson, my homeboy Robert Johnson, right? Supposedly Robert Johnson, the blues player, goes to a crossroads and he trades his soul to the quote unquote devil. And after doing this particular trade, he becomes a virtuoso at the blues guitar, right? It's a really interesting, I guess, a rural legend, so to speak. And he refers to the blues as a Black secret technology. And I become really obsessed with that idea. I was like, wait a minute, because of course, like a lot of people, I think about, you know, technology being like, you know, your cell phone or like your, you know, this printer or something of that nature. You don't really think about it as being like the systems that produce it, or you know, things of this nature. I'm really interested in those ideas, you know, of how technology becomes like an extrapolation of yourself. So I started looking at notions of like, you know, racist technology, right? Because this is something that Beth Coleman writes about in her seminal essay on the subject, where you denature the notion of like identity being something, of racial identity being an actual thing. You know, then it becomes like this kind of like extrapolation, or this technological prosthetic, so to speak, right? So I actually did a whole series just about blues as a technology. It was called Thief at the Crossroads, right? And it's 12 images, some of the greatest blues singers. It's one of my favorites, Nina Simone. And just kind of like, you know, did this as an exhibition at my home, at my alma mater, Jackson State University, one year, just to start thinking about these ideas. So a lot of times when I'm doing like, you know, research projects like this, I am I'm trying to work through the problems by creating like discursive images. So that's what I mean by critical making. So these are things I'm thinking about, and I'll make something that actually relates directly to the research project, so to speak. So a lot of these, I'm really doing a kind of intense show and tell, by the way. So I'm gonna click through a lot of things very, very fast. So then I started thinking about like Afrofuturism and aesthetics. Like, what are some of the commonalities? What is Afrofuturist and what isn't? You know, so a lot of the questions about this, it's become this really popular term that gets bandied about quite a bit now, along with Black speculation and other things. And I was thinking like, well, you know, does everything that's Black and speculative get couched under Afrofuturism? You know, and this is something we'll come back to. But I did notice that there's this really serious attention to this notion of Sankofa, right? Sankofa is this Akan term, West African term, Ghanaian term. This is one of the, and Dinkra stamps for it. I prefer this one because I'm a designer. I like I know everybody's used to the bird that's reaching back over his shoulder, but basically it's a term that means go back and get it, or it's never too late to learn from history. The idea of like being in the present, reaching back to get to the past, and then representing it to future generations, the preservation of history, you know, for future generations. And I noticed that that's a really huge part of Afrofuturism, but also it's kind of like the idea of like time being a circle, or like being not in this linear way of thinking about time, but there's this notion of like co-presence of chronological elements that are happening simultaneously. And so the other half of my portmanteau is narration, right? So Sankofa-ration, right? And so that's kind of like how I think about it. It's a narrative process that is really explicitly using the past to talk about future issues, right? So I think that was something I was really interested in. So little by little, because I was having these conversations with a lot of different people, I ended up starting to do design work for some of the more seminal works on this kind of resurgence of Afrofuturism. Again, you know, if you look at some of the earlier works by like Mark Derry and Alondra Nelson, you know, things from the Afrofuturism listserv, things of that nature. You know, these are people, or even like people like DJ Spooky. You know, that particular aspect of Afrofuturism, it kind of like it gestates into this kind of like new interest in it, and I've often wondered what that, you know, why that is. Some people think it's like, well, one of the aspects is like the election of Barack Obama as president, for instance, right? You have this Black nerd president, and a lot of times the only time you would see a Black president was in a science fiction narrative, right? So that was really interesting. The other thing is the ubiquitous nature of like the tools of creation. You know, so for instance, Photoshop and other types of creative software become really ubiquitous and very accessible. The other thing is how people use the web changes quite a bit. So instead of being like isolated in these little chat rooms and things, you have like these social networking devices where now, you know, you actually have like thousands of like Black nerd sites and things of that nature. So I think like the democratization of the tools of making things like printing on demand and stuff like that jump off in like the early 2000s. So you have like this really kind of this groundswell of people who are kind of isolated being able to talk to each other. So I think those are some of the things I think about when we're talking about like Afrofuturism and how it kind of touches base again. But I think one of the major things though, and I think about this quite a bit, is that this particular iteration of Afrofuturism, I think, is the latest iteration of like a Black arts movement. And that's kind of what I was thinking about. Like whenever you have a movement of some kind, and at this particular point, we're talking about the movement for Black lives, you know, pushing them back against the new Jim Crow, you know, the lots of activism around like climate change and things of that nature, and around access to education. All these different things I think are also conversations that Afrofuturism are directly dealing with. And so when Octavia's Brood came out, which is edited by Adrienne Marie Brown and Walida Amarisha, I actually volunteered to do their cover as soon as I saw it. I was like, oh my God, yes, I need to do this, right? And because I think that they were onto something, because this particular book is a collection of science fiction and speculative fiction written by on-the-ground activists. And so little by little, I started to realize that there were a lot of people who were like involved in these struggles that were actually writing science fiction. You know, they were actually writing like speculative fiction and also practicing what was happening in these particular stories, or utilizing their interest in the community to actually make these things. So, and I'm just kind of quickly going through some of my designs or what have you. I'll go back to Astro Blackness because a lot of people, I don't know if you've heard of this particular this symposium, but it was a piece that Alifu Nama, who's at Loyola Marymount, and still is, that we put together over a couple of years. It's almost like an Afrofuturist think tank. And so this is, like I said, 2014, 2015. And, you know, if you look at like the lineup of the people who are speaking at these two events, they're kind of like a who's who of like who are actually being looked at as experts in, you know, talking about speculation right now and Blackness. So like 2015, you know, I coined this term, the Black Speculative Arts Movement. And as you can see, it was really highly retweeted, right? Like two people like, yeah, whatever, you know. No, but because this is what I was thinking about. I was like, well, it's obvious that there was this really serious interest in social change, and there's also this really big interest in like Black speculative culture. And I was like, okay, just call it the Black Speculative Arts Movement. And before you know it, you know, Ronaldo and at the time Maya Crown Williams created the Black Speculative Arts Movement as a series of like these pop-up events that were basically talking about these issues on the ground, you know, and now they become like international. So really quickly, and this is always difficult to talk about, I was going through some of these different slides. At the same time, me and my best friend Stacy Robinson created this duo called Black Kirby. This is before he became my grad student at University of Buffalo. And we were having this conversation. It was around the same time as the Avengers movie had came out. And the Avengers the movie had made like $1 billion, right? $1 billion, right? Just one movie. Oh my goodness. This is it was insane. And so we're talking about this, but we're also talking about the fact that, you know, Jack Kirby's family tried to get remuneration from Disney at the time too. If you know anything about like the comic book industry, then, or the mainstream comics industry, a lot of it is, most of it's for hire. And it's basically it's this work for hire situation where, you know, you don't own the things that you create, right? And so Stan Lee, of course, you know, is mostly well known for, you know, creating these characters. And I think at the time that Jack Kirby wasn't being credited either. So Stacy was like, you know, this is really an issue around morality. You know, if Stan Lee and Jack are like friends, then shouldn't he be looking out for Jack? You know? And then somewhere up in that conversation, we said, yeah, man, they're treating that brother like he's Black. And then one of us said, yeah, we should call him Black Kirby, laughingly so, right? And then both of us at the same time were like, oh my goodness, what an interesting idea. So we actually created this avatar that samples and remixes Jack Kirby's aesthetic, but through this Afrocentric lens, this kind of social justice lens. It also critiques the comics industry as well. And so the Incredible Hulk becomes the Unkillable Buck, right? Thor becomes the Mighty Shango. The idea is that this particular character is operating in an alternative universe where Jack Kirby was a Black man and was borrowing from like West African mythology and this kind of thing. And over a 4-month period, we created 120 images, and the show toured around the world. And now Black Kirby has extrapolated into like a studio called Motherbox. We do a lot of projects together. We do a lot of pedagogical experimentation together. We work on book cover designs and art direction, and we're coming up on our 10th year working together, actually. Gonna go through these pretty quickly. Sorry, I'm just don't want to butt up against the time. But it's a lot of images. So my friend Stanford Carpenter, who's a cultural anthropologist, and he lives in Chicago, we're talking about Afrofuturism. I was at his house, we're probably drinking like coffee and hanging out for breakfast or something like that. And, you know, we're thinking about the limitations of Afrofuturism, right? In some ways, right? We're like, well, it doesn't necessarily cover all of the spectrum of like, you know, the genres, right? I mean, for instance, I mean, a lot of people take the book Kindred by Octavia Butler and kind of couch it on Afrofuturism, but it also has these really Gothic tropes. You know, the idea of the doppelganger, this kind of mystical element to it, this weird like love triangle. It has different types of like Gothic imagery in it, right? Also the fact that, you know, the time travel happens not with a time travel ship or anything, but it has this kind of mystical existential time travel that's happening, right? It's not explained. So my whole thing is like, well, is something like Daughters of the Dust Afrofuturist? or does it fall into more of a Gothic sensibility, right? Something like Eve's Bayou, is that Afrofuturist? I mean, you know, and it has these different types of mystical elements, these Afro-surrealist elements. So yeah, so my whole thing is like, do you actually get rid of genre tropes in favor of calling something Afrofuturist? Everything can't be Afrofuturist, right? So we came up with this term, the ethnogothic, which to explain it a little bit, it's like, well, if you're trying to get to the Afrofuture, think of Afrofuture as a destination, which I have taken up doing, you know, and that these different ways of thinking about speculation are just tools in your toolbox to get to an Afrofuture. And that's why I call myself an Afrofuturist, not because of an aesthetic, but because I'm very concerned about the future of Black people in the world, right? And now I have a 10-month-old son to worry about, right? So the way I think about the Afrofuture shifted 10 months ago quite a bit. So the idea of this idea of like letting go of these haunted things, right? So the ethnogothic, and this is the way I describe it, the ethnogothic deals with primarily speculative narratives that engage with negatively affective, racialized identities, situated psychological traumas via the traditions of Gothic tropes and technologies such as the grotesque other, body horror, haunted spaces, the hungry ghost, the list goes on. And the idea is like, if you've ever heard this Erykah Badu song, Bag Lady, right? Bag Lady is a song about this woman who's a bag lady who is trying to catch a bus. Now imagine that bus is trying to get to the Afrofuture. So if you're thinking about the lyrics, Erykah Badu is saying, you know, you need to pack light. You need to let that go. Because in that box or that bag might be, you know, the legacies of slavery or oppression or, you know, these different types of haunted things that are in the bag. In order for you to be lighter, so you can actually not drag those into the Afrofuture. So that's kind of what we're thinking about. So hopefully the idea is, and this is a more hopeful thing about like these types of haunted spaces, is that the idea is to kind of like deal with these typical types of racialized traumas and then move into the Afrofuture. So I teach a whole class on just race and horror actually, and that talks about this as a central theme. And this is a visual essay that I did that deals with that. And also create stories. Again, whenever I theorize or think about a particular type of aspect of the speculation, I always make something around it, right? So Blue Hand Mojo, it features the fictitious cousin of Robert Johnson, who's also from Mississippi, who basically trades his soul to the devil, so to speak, for revenge. And basically it's set in this alternative like 1930s Chicago. He migrates up from Mississippi. And what he's doing is he's actually collecting souls for the devil, because what ends up happening is he tricks the devil into getting half of his soul back. So he's actually called like Frank Half Dead Johnson because of that. And so in my story, souls resonate in a particular frequency. And so he's actually composing a song for the devil to, you know, to kind of keep him company in hell. But it's actually kind of this really cool kind of narrative that's around the noir aesthetic, but also thinking about like the Great Migration and things of that nature. And here's just some images around that. I go through a lot of different iterations of things too, a lot of different styles. This is let me see here. This is the final piece that I did with Bill Campbell at Rosarian Publishing. Very noir, very black and white, and dealing with like different formal constraints around how comics are kind of being constructed. Another thing, and this is actually a project that we just got funded with Rosarian through Kickstarter, it's called Box of Bones. And this particular project was actually, it came out of a conversation with Ronaldo Anderson about like, well, you know, what happens if Black people don't get justice? What happens then, you know? And so we came with this idea that, you know, this particular rage would kind of like bubble up and it would actually like be in this box. And it's about this Black woman who is from the South, who is a graduate student at Berkeley, actually. and actually my friend Lee Rayford is a character in the book, and it's co-written by Ayize Jama Everett, who's from the Bay Area, who I met through Lee Rayford and Michael Cohen at their place. And we've been working on this for like 5 years. And the central themes, I always like to think of it as like Afrocentric Hellraiser, if you're familiar with Clive Barker's work. So all the different characters are based off of the most terrifying aspects of like, slavery, or like the things that Black people actually are totally terrified. This is a sentient lynching tree, for instance. It's called the Wretched, which I get from the Wretched of the Earth. Also, too, the design is inspired by Toni Morrison's Beloved as well. That quote about like swift, unnavigable rivers and the baboon with the bloody teeth. That whole, I'm going to totally jack up the quote, so I'm going to stop saying things. So the other one is the Suffering, which is a character that's kind of based off, the notions of a hypermasculine Black body. The Dark, who is kind of like the pinhead of the crew. The Nobody, which comes from that song Nobody Knows the Trouble I See, right? It represents like the hollowing out of Black culture and the reselling of Black culture. The Burden, which represents the fungible aspects of like slavery. It's essentially like a cotton sack that like is filled with like slave parts, and it kind of crawls around. It's the thing that scares me the most. What I was trying to do is create characters that terrify me. I'm a really big horror fan. So this is the Night Doctor. It represents medical apartheid, and the fact that Black people's bodies have been experimented on for generations to further medical experiments, from the creation of the speculum all the way up to Henrietta Lacks, right? So, and so again, through the idea of critical making, I'm really taking these ideas and putting them into like a reified, storytelling space. And here are some pieces from it, because I got so busy working on Octavia Butler work that we couldn't finish it. So we actually had to work with different artists, which is actually what slowed down the process, but also made it a very rich process. This work is by Barrington Edwards. Here's some inspirations for some of the designs. They're all based off of historical references of different types of degradation to like the Black body. Here's some pages I did for the first chapter. Sorry, some of these are totally terrifying. So actually, Avery Jeter did this piece on my right. She's actually an artist that lives in the Bay Area. On the left, we have images from Brian Christopher Moss. We really work with like some very talented artists on this project. And I think actually working with a crew of different people made it a very rich experience. And this is about to come out probably next year. We just got the Kickstarter funded, and it's going to be a collection of the first 5 chapters, and the last 5 chapters will be out hopefully shortly after that. And so it's just a 10-part story that's really about Lindsay Ford, who again is this researcher and a graduate student from Berkeley, who was trying to find the stories about this box and kind of piece them together. And she starts to realize little by little, her and her partner Hatima are traveling around and finding these different pieces. And she realizes that she's connected to the box in some way, that her destiny is connected to it. These pieces are by David, my friend David Brain, who I'm working on a project with now. So I'm gonna slide into this really quickly, in this idea of design fiction. So I mentioned this notion of Black Kirby. I didn't realize at the time that we were actually doing design fiction. So Bruce Sterling comes up with this idea of diegetic prototypes in design fiction. Ironically, Bruce Sterling is also one of the forefathers of like cyberpunk. So something that's a diegetic prototype or discursive design is something that creates a story world, has something that's being prototyped in that story world, or is created to create like a discursive kind of element. So basically the idea is that this particular diegetic thing is created in this story world, this design piece, to have a conversation. It's not to be mass produced or anything like that. It's just created to have a conversation. So speculative design is basically dealing with these wicked problems by speculation of, okay, well, what if this particular thing happened and you had to make such and such object, that kind of thing. And so a lot of times this type of thinking is coming out of like industrial design. And the first time I came across it is this book called Speculative Everything by Anthony Dunn and Fiona Raby. And it's one of the only books on it. And they were using notions of like traditional or more Eurocentric like science fiction and fantasy to talk about these, well, science fiction, not fantasy, to talk about these design issues. And I was wondering, like, why weren't they dealing with like something by, say, Derek Bell? Because to me, Space Traders by Derek Bell is like a design fiction piece that talks about race, as a construction, right? So I found that there was a limitation to a lot of the things they were talking about. Around the same time, I was still at University of Buffalo, and I was teaching a design studio called Race as Science Fiction, because that's kind of what it is, right? I mean, it's a fictionalized idea that actually has become part of us, and it's become like socialized in a particular way. And so I thought about using my acumen as a design historian and as a maker to think about race as a designed object, right? Or as a discursive object, that has these different properties around it. And so thinking about that too, me and my friend Ronaldo Anderson worked with the Schomburg to put on this thing called Unveiling Visions, the Alchemy of the Black Imagination. And this is like 2015 as well. So we used Sherry Renee Thomas's work on dark matter as kind of a canon, because if you're not familiar with that particular book, it's a collection of Black speculative fiction over the last, say, like 150 years or so. So you have stuff like Du Bois's work, The Comet, had things like The Conjure Woman by Charles Chestnut, things of that nature, really canonized early Black speculative fiction from different genres, right? So that's a particular thing right there. We looked at that as a foundation. Kevin Young's idea of the shadow book, this notion of books that haunt the existence of other books. This is from his book, The Grey Album, right? And we could talk about that more because I love that concept so much, because the idea is like, well, if it's a shadow book, is there a shadow library? Are there shadow people? Is there a shadow world? Is there a shadow gallery? So you start building that out and you start asking these questions, and we use that concept to create this exhibition. John Aconfer's Data Thief, but instead of an archaeologist, he's a curator, right? And this is actually in the Lewis Latimer Gallery in the Schomburg. And then W.E.B. Du Bois's Construction of the Veil, which at the time I was thinking about it as like a visual culture, like an app that you could see through. And we were actually gonna have like augmented reality, but we weren't able to actually implement it. But now I'm thinking that what we were doing was curating inside of the veil, because the veil to me functions kind of like a parallel universe. It might as well be like an alternative universe, the way he writes about it, right? Maybe. So anyway, so all that comes to this culmination of what I call critical race design studies, an interdisciplinary design practice that intersects critical race theory, speculative design, design history, and critical making. Notice in my little chart that critical making is really big, right? Because I think that you need to make things to talk about these issues, right? And analyze basically and critique the effects of visual communication, graphic objects, and their associated systemic mediations on racial identity. What started me thinking about this was like, well, if race is a construction, where are the blueprints, right? I need to look at them so we can fix them. Everything else gets updated constantly. My phone is always updated, right? So can we update these other concepts? And so I start thinking about that, and why do they not get updated? So I created this thing called a manifesto, a series of questions around race and design, like, can you racialize a letter? Obviously you can, like the letter N, right? And all these particular things actually fall into design. The notion of like legible bodies and illegible bodies, that's a design question, So this curatorial exercise coupled with exposure to the concepts around speculative design made me start thinking about race as a type of design fiction. And we often refer to it as a systematic construct. And basically we construct and consume space around it like it's a real thing. But what if we looked at it as a designed object or a discursive object or a diegetic prototype? What if we thought about racist systems as very effectively designed deliverables or products that could be redesigned or undesigned, right? So then I started looking for diegetic prototypes like Dunn and Raby's books, and these were actually in the exhibition, looking for diegetic discursive objects in Black literature. That was fun, by the way. So what if there was a collection of Afrocentric musical instruments whose music was deadly, but only to white people? This was written in 1966 by Henry Dumas. Will the Circle Be Unbroken? This is the Afro horn. It's an object that is having that conversation in that story. What if there was a pair of shoes that allowed you to fly? This is by Amiri Baraka in 1990, M. Chawi. What if there was a chair that turned Black people into white people? That's Black No More by George Schuyler. That's 1931. That's a science fiction story, 1931. So what if there was a device that could sense off-duty police officers? That's Pig Detector by Amiri Baraka. That's 2000. What's really crazy though is like while we were curating this, Britt Russert and Adrian Brown were going through Du Bois's paper, and they found a previously unnoticed science fiction story called The Princess Steel. And in that particular story, which is written, actually this is wrong, I think it's 1909 actually, it's a device that can actually see through time and space. It's called the megascope. And you're gonna see that pop up again. And it's used as a framing mechanism to kind of like put forth a fantasy story that actually is a critique of the US steel industry. First of all, what? And the second thing is, that's a science fiction trope. The idea of the framing story, that's straight up sci-fi. And he was so Du Bois was a huge nerd. He was a big blurred, and he was writing science fiction to talk about these issues. And this was written while he was still in Atlanta, right? So Black people were speculated into existence, and that speculation was supported by generations of visual culture and design propaganda. Then we, the speculated, have used that same technology to critique society and the persistence of our disenfranchisement. So the other thing I want to talk about really quickly, and I'm really going to go through this really fast because I really don't want to. Only got 12 minutes left. Is that right? It's crazy. I'm like, I'm not going to get through this. I'm going to stop when it rings. I'm serious. I was watching this talk with Bell Hooks and also Theaster Gates, and they were having this conversation at the New School. And Theaster was talking about the idea of the MFA and how that the MFA, the Masters in Fine Arts, which is a terminal degree in art, gives you a certain amount of control over a particular way of thinking, right? But when he's doing these projects in Chicago, where he's buying up old spaces and flipping them and turning them into new places for the community, he's really still making vessels, because he's a ceramicist. He makes vessels, right? So he's still making these vessels. And so I was thinking about that in my making these safe spaces. So these are some of the shows that I've co-sponsored or co-founded with a lot of help from different collaborators. The largest Black independent comic book festival at the Schomburg is called the Black Comic Book Festival, co-founded by myself, Jerry Kraft, Deirdre Holman, and the great Jonathan Gales. And this is the largest convention of its kind. Brings like maybe 10,000 people a year. It's totally free, and it's at one of the blickety blackest spaces on the planet, the Schomburg, right on Lenox Avenue, also known as Malcolm X Boulevard, right? And this is what it looks like, when it's at peak. When it's at peak time, right? And this space obviously is not made to hold a convention, but basically what's interesting is that what we're trying to do is realign Black subjectivity to a certain degree. So imagine being a little Black kid coming into this space and seeing nothing but Black folk or people of color making images that look just like you, for you. And you basically, you kind of like create a design situation where you have these people who never have to know what it's like to not be subject. So they are the center of discussion. And for those 2 days, they are the norm. They are the default, so to speak. Not norm, the default. You know what I'm saying? So that's one of the things we started making with these particular shows. But then I realized after that talk that I'm actually still doing design. I'm just designing experiences and designing spaces, right? And I've actually co-curated a bunch of these different shows. Planet Deep South, the third one just happened in Atlanta. And the idea is that speculation, a lot of it starts in the South. People like Bree Newsom, who snatched the flag down from the South Carolina Capitol. Henry Dumas was from the South. Actually, Sunrise from the South. David Banner, Zora Neale Hurston, John A. Williamson. Janelle Monáe's base is in Atlanta now. So this idea of these particular thinkers and their ideas of escaping from that space. I mean, I often say that the first Afrofuturist was the first slave that said, you know what, slavery sucks, I'm leaving. I'm going, that's a really Afrofuturist notion, right? I'm getting the heck up out of here. All the people that migrated out of there were like talking about those particular types of issues and trying to make a better life. Then of course, really quickly, I want to talk about the Octavia Butler work, which is something that actually really could have been the center of the talk, really. But Damien Duffy and I a couple of years ago were honored to be chosen to adapt Kindred into a graphic novel. Very daunting task, and I think mostly people were very had very positive notions about it. It sold really well. We actually ended up getting a Bram Stoker Award for it, Eisner Award for it. But I think it's opened a lot of doors as far as like looking at Black speculation, really celebrating and leaning into the legacies of Octavia E. Butler's work, and it was a very daunting task. The artwork took 4 months to do, even though that was was a very short amount of time. And I was trying to use really like difficult media to work with for this particular project. So I actually drew most of the book with Sharpies. I was trying to create things that were like brutal. I was really influenced by the German Expressionist movement. People like Kathy Kollwitz, Franz Maserio were inspirations for it. Really wanted to create like this kind of very difficult blocky style for it, to kind of get across the issues around Dana time traveling back through from like 1976 to the 1800s. And so a lot of these ideas around, time travel, and I actually just came up with this notion that I called dynia chronosomatic travel. So dynia means pain, chrono means time, and somatic means body, because I keep noticing all these different Black time travel stories that actually are galvanized or instigated by pain to the Black body. And you can look at like stuff like Sankofa, or like certain episodes of the Twilight Zone that I've seen, or even stuff like Mark Twain's time travel story, A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court. It comes from like being hit by a car or by a cart or something like that. So I was like, well, what is it about pain that actually like causes people to time travel? Here I'm doing like kind of a cover reveal for the second part of the talent series. The left side is actually like the original drawing for Lauren Olamina from Parable of the Sower. The blue side is going to be the cover for Parable of Talents, because the idea is that these are the same person, but she's going through such a journey. After the success of like Kindred, Damien and I were asked what was the next project that we wanted to do. And after the election of Donald J. Trump to the office of president, we realized that we had to do Parable of the Sower. It's like a wake-up call. To a certain degree, if Kindred was talking about the issues around slavery and the haunted ideas around slavery, this particular piece was talking about the dangers of climate change, the dangers of like, inequities and class inequities. And so it's about a young woman who starts a new religion. So basically her piece is that, we've destroyed this planet. We need to get off of it. We need to actually, in order for us to have a better future, we need to seed the universe. So she creates this religion called Earthseed, right? And so and this is a very fraught piece. Now, mind you, my wife was carrying Jackson at the time. So it was an 8-month process. So he was gestating, and this particular book was gestating at the same time. It was pretty wild. And the more I worked on this project, the more I realized, like, man, Jackson could inherit a world like this. I mean, we have to be really careful. And it was a very difficult book to do. It was a very difficult book to do because of that. So those are some of the things I want to talk about with that particular piece. I hope you have questions about it. But one of the things I love about it is that it's kind of this epistolary. It actually has a shadow book inside of it, which is like the Lauren Olamila's journal, and also the journal that actually creates, that becomes like the Earthseed book of the living, because it's actually sampling pieces from this shadow book that exists within another book. It's called like the removed shadow book. Similar thing with like the Intuitionists, where they have this book called Theoretical Elevators in it, right? Where it's like you have pieces of it that actually support the main narrative, but there's another book that really doesn't exist that we only get a little bit of. Really interesting stuff. I'm such a geek about that kind of stuff. But here's some of the pages from the illustrations. One of the main differences between this book and the previous book is that this was totally done on the iPad. This was totally illustrated digitally with Procreate. I learned a lot from the first book. One of the first things was to use people to help with the coloring. So I actually had coloring assistants on this project, and also how to pace myself differently with using a different media. So I think I'm gonna I have like 4 minutes. I'm like, you know what? I'm not gonna talk about this session. I know. Ask me about it later, because I got 4 minutes. I do too much. I'm sorry. That's my wife said. She said I do too much. Ask me about it later, or not. I knew I was gonna do this. I always like pack a talk like this, and just kind of mess up my time. Things that I'm most excited about. There's a book edited by Donald Lynn Washington coming out. There's a collection of my interviews from my home state, University of Mississippi. They put out a collection of conversations, and this one is like in their comics conversation section. So, basically, if you want to hear me blather on about more of this stuff, you can actually pick up this book. I think it drops in August, I believe. But it's on Amazon for pre-order. The other thing I'm really excited about is I love that concept of the megascope, a device that can see through time and space into other dimensions. Great name for a comic book line, don't you think? So basically, over the last 2 years, I've been curating a collection of books that are specifically for and about people of color and speculation. So one of the projects I'm really excited about, for instance, is a climate fiction centered or cli-fi fiction or like solar punk version of the Count of Monte Cristo that's set 400 years after the polar ice caps melt, right? That's illustrated by a Bayesian artist, you know, from Barbados, and actually written by Ayuze Jama Everett, who I did the Box of Bones project with. Or a project with Yatasha Womack, who wrote the Afrofuturism book, with Tana Tucker, who's also from the Bay Area. It's a book called Black Cube that is about a duo of ancient Egyptian gods who, once they realize that they're not being worshipped anymore, open an intergalactic, interdimensional gallery space that celebrates Black life. It's called Black Cube. So it's like if Sandman was like Afrocentric, you know, that kind of thing. Yeah, and so the first two books, actually one of which I should be drawing right now, and I'm sure that if my publisher's watching this, they're like, why aren't you coloring? One is an adaptation of Nnedi Okorafor's short story, which I totally adore, called On the Road. We decided to call it After the Rain to disambiguate it from the Kerouac novel. But it's illustrated by David Brame and adapted by myself, and I did the colors on the piece. And this is the first book from the Megascope line that's coming out in the fall. And also the amazing Sean Martinborough, who is a master of like neo-noir, or just noir in general, has this book called The Heavy that is coming out as also just a spectacular book. So these are the first two books from this long list of books that I've been curating over the last 2 years. So again, just to kind of sew this up, I think that there's a lot to be said about being interdisciplinary. I think there's a lot to be said about having an open mind about things. I think that we're trained to think about a particular track maybe a little bit too much. And I think that you never know how you end up if you travel different roads and maybe intersect them from time to time. And so, yeah, I think that's about all I have to say for right now about Cyborgs and Crossroads. And I hope I didn't bore you or like confuse you too much. The end. So.
Oh my gosh, you didn't bore or confuse us at all. I think, you know, you promised us an intense show and tell, and I think that is exactly what we got. I just want to say thank you so much. This has been an amazing, it's so cool to hear you talk and to hear about all your different projects. And yeah, we have some good questions lined up. So let me just say, thank you so much for sharing your work. My name is Fantasia Painter. I'm one of the students in the Graduate Fellows Program, which is hosting the event. And I just wanted to plug again that we're currently fundraising for the students. Oh, your talk's over, I guess.
That was my alarm, sorry.
No, it's all good. We're currently fundraising for the students who will be in the program next year. So if anybody can donate, the link is in the live stream. This program means a lot to a lot of us, so we'd greatly appreciate anything that y'all can give. And we also understand that not everyone can give right now. The chat is also the place to go. I just want to mention, if you have questions for Professor Jennings, post them there and one of us will ask it for you. So I guess let's get started with the Q&A if you're up for it.
Sure.
Cool.
Yeah. It's a little warm. I'm like, I always get like, you know, it's this doggone jacket.
Kind of like, yeah. I think if you can kind of like use,
I'm good.
Like,
No,
okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So Ace the Outsider asks, on your pointed genres, how do we protect the Afro-Futurist / Black Speculative movement from being exploited? Should people who are directly involved in the movement be the ones developing content?
I think for the most part, yes. It's difficult because we're in a capitalist society, right? It's very difficult, right? And that's and people have to eat. So you have this one particular piece where if you want a lot of support for your particular projects, then a lot of times you have to work with, with the quote unquote mainstream or what have you. But because there are now like different social networks that are very independent, you have a lot of different publishers out there that are, like Rosarian Publishing, like Milton Davis's company with Balagoon Ojitade, who are successful independent publishers who have a particular vision around, what they consider to be an upstanding representation of a quote unquote Afrofuturist aesthetic. I think it's very difficult. It's a very difficult thing because as long as we're in this particular system, it's going to be a very hard road to hoe. I mean, even with particular, you know, with the things we're doing with Megascope, I mean, at the end of the day, you know, we want people to support, you know, by paying for those particular stories, and you're supporting people that way. I think the other thing too is that you have to realize that you have different strands of, you know, representation too. Like for instance, a lot of people that I talk about in the Black Comics Returns book, or, you know, that me and Damien did, that's an independent market. That's an independent comics movement, you know, that's been around for a very long time. But a lot of those people work in quote unquote mainstream comics as well. So I think what you do is you diversify and you try to be as as upstanding as possible in those particular belief structures and try to put out the best work possible, you know. But it is a difficult problem. I don't know if I'm smart enough to solve it by myself, honestly. That's a great question. It's something that I struggle with a lot too, you know. But I'm pretty sure that, you know, a lot of the people who are working, they want to be successful in a particular way, but also get out their work to as many people as possible. So everything's a negotiation until it's not.
And I would like to like dovetail on this, so I might be going a little bit out of order of questions, so forgive me. Is Afrofuturism a representative of other perspectives besides Afro-American viewpoint? Where does Afro-Caribbean, Afro-Brazilian fit into this idea of Afrofuturism?
I think that idea is up to whoever's creating it. And the reason why I say that is because you have these different strands of representation, because those different cultures are similar, but they're different because of the experiences of the people in the diaspora, right? So you do have people who are doing work in, like for instance, we're publishing a book that's from Barbados, actually. Like I would even call it, it's this Afro-Caribbean science fiction story called Hard Ears that we're putting out, right? And I think to a certain degree, the original ideas that Derry put forth as far as like what is Afrofuturism, it's a very specific set of questions around being African American. He said, and he puts that into the definition. I think in some ways it's a limitation. I do think that what Ronaldo Anderson calls Afrofuturism 2.0 is a lot more inclusive of the diaspora and of other different mindsets. So if you look at like those differences, I think that this particular version of or update, so to speak, of Afrofuturism is a lot more inclusive to all those different sensibilities. But, you know, I think that, and this is something I was just talking to my friend Julian Chambliss about fairly recently, is that if you're talking about Afrofuturism as a touch point for like different types of like Black liberation politics, you know, someone who's dreaming of freedom in Lagos or Tanzania has a very different idea about what that politic is than someone who's in Detroit or like, you know, Tupelo, Mississippi. You know what I'm saying? So I think that maybe there does need to be like other strands of it. I think it's a really good starting point, and that Black speculative culture as an umbrella is a better. It's just a bigger word. Afrofuturism is really catchy. You know what I'm saying? It's kind of like breakdancing instead of b-boying. You know, it's a term that actually gets you started. You know, and I think a lot of times in the academy we do get caught up in terms. You know. But I think also the Afrofuture is more of a destination, and I think we not necessarily worry that much about like how we get there, you know. But that's just me. I think I'm rambling a little bit, but it's a difficult question. But I think that there should be other spaces if you want to create them. You know, like I have a section, I have a designation called the Ethnographic because I didn't think Afrofuture was big enough. I have this designation called Conjure Punk that thinks about like conjuring hoodoo as a technology in the future. Nnedi Okorafor talks about African futurism, where like, you know, it's very, very centered in Africa, right? Yeah, and Milton Davis came up with this term, and Balogun Ojitade came up with this term, cyberfunk, where we're talking about Black folk and future cyberpunk spaces. I came up with this storytelling space, it's called Cybertrap, that's specifically Black and Southern, you know? So I think what it is like, you know, you kind of get in where you fit in and think about speculation, but at the end of the day, a Black future is something that we're all concerned with. And I think we start there and not fight about it, you know.
Okay.
I think that kind of leads into the next question that I have from Jasmine Moore, which is, do you think that the Afro-Gothic is guided by utopian impulses to reclaim or to heal? Is it related to futurity in some way?
You know, I think that the way that Stanford and I were talking about it, that I'm not necessarily utopic. I don't know. I don't necessarily think that utopias are possible just because people, you know, you know, you know. Yeah, but a better space. I think that you know, the idea is to rid ourselves of these particular type of haunted spaces. I was having this conversation with a new colleague, Erica Lloyd. She's a professor of philosophy, no, psychology here. She's new. And so she was talking about this idea that why is it that these ideas of speculation are always, you know, dealing with fighting against, you know, white oppression or like, you know, racist oppression and things like that. And like I said before we started talking, I was talking about like a lot of my work in horror comes from like anger. I'm just really pissed off about how Black people have been treated throughout the world, and I'm not ready to let it go. You know, and maybe I'm not of that generation that can. Maybe Jasmine can, you know, but I'm not really sure. I think the conversation is to kind of like deal with the horrors of the everyday, really painful things that Black folk or people of color go through on a day-to-day basis, and try to let them go through catharsis. Should try to get to a better future. Now, quite recently, I did come up with this idea called racecraftian horror, which is a lot more like not as hopeful. And the reason why I was thinking about, I'm obsessed with like H.P. Lovecraft and the fact that, you know, he's like this crazy xenophobic, you know, writer whose work is immortal because of the fact he shared his universe and he came with these really interesting ideas about cosmic horror. And then I came across this book called Racecraft. I want to say it was written like 2011 by these sisters who are actually siblings, actually. And I forget their names right now. I don't have the book in front of me. But they basically posit race as a spell, like witchcraft. So they're actually using the term witchcraft to talk about race because it's so arcane and strange, right? And I was like, well, damn. So we can actually use this idea of like the ethnographic and kind of extrapolate it into what I would call a racecraftian narrative, which, you know, I would want to work on, that deals with the idea of like the cosmic awe of being like pulled over, you know, by a cop and killed, potentially killed, or, you know, listening to your radio too loud and being killed, or being in your own house and being shot, you know, because you're Black, right? So that to me, that is not as hopeful. So I'm thinking of that particular, that we have these different strands of affect, you know. A lot of things about affect, and that's something that we in Stanford talked about a lot. So that's a long-winded answer to a very simple question, but I think it is about the Black future, or not necessarily utopia, but definitely a better space.
Mhm.
Okay, I'm gonna stop.
Thank you. No, thank you.
I rambled, man. I'm so sorry.
No, it's great. I think what I'm getting is that there are a couple of like clustering questions. So people seem like they want like a good list of like, how do you start? Like, what are some great artists and thinkers,
Oh man.
Black speculative fiction, Afrofuturism that folks can kind of like start diving into?
I mean, a really good place to start is Sherry Renee Thomas's collection, two collections actually, Dark Matter, right? Because there's two. One is called, I think it's The Throwing of the Bones, or The Reading of the Bones. It's the second one. I think she's working on a third one. There's a great collection called New Suns that was co-edited by Nisi Shaw. There's this wonderful collection called Mothership that I did the cover for, that was edited by Ed Hall and Bill Campbell. But of course, you know, you could start with also looking at like Samuel Delaney's work. You know, Samuel Delaney is a genius. And so some of his work like Babel 17, which is groundbreaking, Nova, Dahlgren, things of that nature. I could probably send you all a list later. I don't have it in front of me, or I can just send you my syllabus for my intro class, you know, that kind of stuff. Also, I know for Black speculative work, I mean, look at Nnedi Okorafor's work, the amazing N.K. Jemisin's work, Nalo Hopkinson, if you're looking at like Afro-Caribbean science fiction and fantasy, my colleague Nalo Hopkinson is a really great place to start with, like Brown Girl in the Ring, Sister Mine, Midnight Robber. She also edited, I think 3 collections of like speculative fiction herself, like So Long Been Dreaming actually is a collection that she edited. So there's a bunch of like really meaty places to start. And if you want to do looking at some other alternative history speculation, you're looking at people like Stephen Barnes's work, like Lion's Blood, his partner and wife's work, Tananarive Due, who has a whole series of like horror stories. You got up and comers in horror like Eden Royce, right? Or Kenesha Williams, or Chesia Burke. Oh, that's a really great collection too. There's a collection of like Black women that's edited by Black women, that's published by a Black woman. It's called, I think it's Daughters of Sycorax, you know, and it was nominated for a Bram Stoker Award. So that's a bunch. It's a bunch of stuff. That was a lot of things I said. As far as like comics, then you're looking at like Milestone Media, the work by like Roosevelt Pitt, looking at like Rosarium's work as well. There's a bunch of like Black independent comics out there. My book that I co-edited with Damian Duffy called Black Comics Returns has a bunch of like Black independent comics artists in it. So those are things.
Well, I just want to jump in for a little bit there too, because it seems like everybody wants you to know how much they're really appreciating this talk, and there's a lot of comments regarding that, and so I guess kind of fangirling a little bit. If I can take up a question, Fantasia, if you don't mind.
Of course.
And so I one thing that I'm seeing, and you can let me know about, like the gender equality around Afrofuturism and speculative fiction, because I hear a lot of women, Black women from different diasporas, and I personally have been like reading just a collection of African American, women from the African diaspora. So you have like Nydia Okafor, like you mentioned, a few of them, but they're not necessarily just based within the US or just based in Africa. There's a lot of cross-continental,
That's right.
I would say cross-generational also telling. So just to like tease that out a little bit, if you can go into this sort of gender as well as the multiplicity of the Black diaspora within Afrofuturism, if you can talk to that, that'd be great.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, just to kind of borrow from some of the stuff that Yatasha Womack talks about, I think that there is definitely like a very Black womanist, vibe to Black speculation. I mean, if you look at it, like most of the well-known authors in that area are Black women, right? I mean, I think that is very telling. That focusing on those particular types of struggles, I think, brings out some of the nuances of the Black experiences that have been kind of erased, in traditional, literature in general. So yeah, I would say definitely that there are a lot of like women of color from the diaspora, like that are writing in these different like speculative genres and doing it extremely well. That's the first thing. I mean, there's a reason why the mothership is is called the mothership, right? That idea, is of or the motherland, right? These types of ideas around Black womanist idea, Black womanist notions are something that I think is very prevalent. But yeah, I think there is like. I think of like Black speculative culture as, like I said, a big umbrella. People will try to tease out like, well, is this Afro-surrealism? Which honestly, it's like some of my work probably falls into that area too. Shout out to D. Scott Miller, who's from the Bay Area. And also these other types of extrapolations into like maybe different like darker genres, that I have a tendency for because I'm trying to work out things. I think that there's a different contingent of Black women who are working in those spaces too. Some of them I kind of threw out, people like Eden Royce and Kenesha Williams and I think Nicole Smith, is that right? Yeah, so there's a bunch of people working in those areas too. So not only are we looking at diverse voices throughout the diaspora, but we're also looking at like a diverse feminist or womanist voices throughout genres too. And a lot of them are overlapping too. The piece that I just selected from Nettie's work is what she calls African Jujuist, right? Because she's looking at juju, magic from the idea of like magic from Nigeria as like the undertones that she's dealing with, right? I think that in general, speculative fiction gives us a certain amount of distance from a project, from a problem. So it's one thing to get into a fight about something policy driven or political that's in our real space, but when you kind of reify it into a story or a different type of narrative, you can actually talk about it in a different way that actually doesn't really cause as much friction. So, and you can see like the ways that speculative fiction were used by like Gene Roddenberry and people like that, and to talk about really big social issues, and we still do. And I think that's one of the values of using a Black radicalized imagination from various standpoints to talk about the issues. Did that help? Because now again, I feel like I'm rambling because these are really big questions, but I was like, they're so complex. You know, they're kind of deceptive because it's like they look like they're simple, but it's like no, there's a lot under there. And I think what we need to watch out for is the hyper-commodification of Afrofuturism. You're going to see, as my friend Ronaldo Anderson talks about, like fake Afrofuturists, or people who are like trying to just use the aesthetics, you know. And of course, if you see something like Black Panther, or that's really successful, you're going to see like different people trying to do knockoffs and things of that nature. But it has opened the door for more stories around, you know, Black speculative, you know, futures or past or presence even. Or I guess it doesn't matter if it's flattening, right? Yeah, so I think that's something to think about, because my friend and you know, former teacher Doyle Moore, God rest him, used to say that insiders see content, outsiders see form, and form is always easier to you know, to manifest or to copy. You know, you take out the shell. That's how a lot of cultures get copied and sold back to us anyway. So I think it's very it's great to have conversations about aesthetics, but it's also realizing that also aesthetics have, like, you know, social and political value, particularly coming from a Black or Afrocentric standpoint. But be wary and understand that there are other things outside of aesthetics that are talking about, because you can actually look at this particular culture through so many different lenses. I mean, if you look at like the work that Clint Fluker and Charles Johnson and Ronaldo Anderson have done on their 2 volumes, which I think are just amazing. You know, those 2 Afrofuturism 2.0 books are just, people who are like religious scholars looking at Afrofuture, and people who are like working in like Black feminist studies. It's ridiculous. Like, so that means that it actually is a lens or an epistemology that you can actually see through. So I think that is really important. So
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
The next question comes from Jordan Michael, and Jordan asks about the Octavia Butler catalog. Are there plans for doing a visual media universe like the Marvel Cinematic Universe model?
Okay, well, that would be amazing. First of all, that's not a question that I would know, because when we did the project, essentially, you know, we started out with work for hire. You know, we were hired by Abrams Comic Arts to do a job. You know, Damien and I love Octavia Butler's work. We put a lot of heart and soul into those pieces. But at the end of the day, those particular types of decisions will be made by the estate and the estate agent. So at this particular point, we're definitely wanting to do more graphic novels based off of her work. Also, as you can see, there are several things that are in negotiation now. Nedia Corafor and Winuri Cahill are like showrunners for a Wild Seed TV show that's set to be on Amazon. And also, it seems that Ava DuVernay and a partner have just signed something with Amazon as well to do Dawn, which is another one of our most popular books too. So I think that would be really amazing, you know. And now that I think about it, I really want that to happen now. So I'm like, but I don't know. That would be great though.
All right, and so we have room for just a couple more questions. And so this is coming from Angela Aguilar, which is one of our fellows. So she said she's really resonated with your discussion exploring race and as through design. So cultural workers, designers, artists have always played central parts in social shifts. We're experiencing a tense global social and cultural shift currently. What do you see the role of science fiction, Black speculative arts will play across sectors in time of pandemic? I'm thinking like policy changes, labor shifts, food systems. Can you talk about that?
You know, that's a really interesting question. Another one of my favorite scholars and thinkers around this stuff is Martine Sims. She has this it's a really cool thing called the Mundane Afro-Futurist Manifesto, which at first I took like offense to. I was like, oh my God, we mean no spaceships and things of that nature, right? And if you read it, it's like, oh, you know, all the things we love about science fiction, and she gets the idea from the, it's inspired by the Mundane Science Fiction Manifesto, I think. And really what she's asking though is a very similar question, is how do we actually like reframe systems, and because most issues are systemic, let's be really about it. Like most of them are systemic. You can't just fix one thing. And that's why the idea of like imagining solutions to wicked problems, give us a roadmap or a really interesting way to kind of figure out things. So I think that, using prototyping or, speculation, different types of narratives to interrogate what's going on in those systems is a good way to start. But I think the next step is then to actually like take that as like data and use critical making to like present these particular ideas to people who can make the changes, on the ground. Which is difficult because again, all these problems are wicked. One is nested inside the other. They're interplaying off of each other. So it's a really, really interesting conversation to have, but I think it's possible. And I think that, it has to start with a radical speculation or reimagining of the systems that have oppressed us too. And I always say this too, one of the first Afrofuturists I think about is Dr. King, right? Thinking about that, he uses the idea of a Afrofuturist, quote unquote, utopia, the mountaintop, as a space that we need to get to. He doesn't give us a roadmap to get there, but what he's talking about is major policy changes. He's talking about like really, really hard work on the ground by activists, by getting more people to vote, by changing things, So it's a destination, so to speak. It's the prize, so to speak, right? And I think that's the thing we need to keep working at. And that sometimes you need that escape too. I mean, there's this aspect of like problem solving. Everything doesn't necessarily have to be about the problem, but I think that speculation gives us a space where we can actually kind of play and work out things, in our heads and with each other. So that's why I love Octavia's Brood so much. Super smart. I'm like, yeah, start there and then see how we can change policy that way.
So this question comes from a colleague of mine in ethnic studies, Marcelo Felipe Garzo Montalvo. And actually, I think Marcelo's got a couple of questions, but I'll start here. It says, this is such an inspiring talk, amazing, powerful, and prolific. Thank you for taking the time to share and visit with us virtually. And then in parentheses, it says, real talk, when do you sleep though?
That's really funny. Probably, I don't know, not a lot. Especially now, like now I have like a 10-month-old. I'm always two things. I do sleep, I'm always working on projects. I think that if you're thinking about narrative in different ways, that much to my wife's chagrin, like my head is in the clouds a lot. Yeah, so I'm always like, huh, what'd you say? Go get a diaper, huh? What? It's kind of like, because I'm always in the back of my head is like a subroutine. The other thing too is that you have to be a gracious collaborator. I think too. I work on a lot of amazing people: Damian Duffy, David Brame, Stacey Robinson, Bill Campbell. The list goes on and on. And I think that that is really kind of a superpower. Is I'm a connector, and I think about like, well, how can these people work together? I'm always thinking about, well, there's systems that actually have put us in this particular place. We have to create like counter systems. So I think those are some of the things that I think about, and I'm always working. So I am working all the time. It's kind of crazy.
It seems like it, and I think it's paying off. Like we are absolutely. It's so cool to see all the projects that you've been working on. So we're glad that you don't get that much sleep.
That's terrible. That's so terrible. I would like to, I would like to, but I don't know. I think that you're only here for a small amount of time, and it goes by fast. It really does. It's like, I was thinking about like my son who just his last antic was that today he reaches into my wife's like cereal bowl. She was so pissed. It's hilarious. 10 months ago, those hands didn't exist. You see what I'm saying? So yeah, it goes by really fast. So play hard and sleep later, I guess. I don't know. Doctor Who used to say sleep is for tortoises. That's pretty funny.
So I think we're going to try to squeeze in one more question if
Read.
you're willing. It's like it's a question / comment.
Okay.
And hopefully we can leave on a lighter note, but it's a pretty deep question. And so it goes into this form of pain-causing time travel. Sounds like a form of PTSD. Interesting intersection with art and psychology and even wellness. And
Mm,
this is from Manu Maltani.
mhm.
Forgive me if I'm saying your name wrong. Can you give us some thoughts on that? On what?
Yeah, it was something. Well, it came from this. I recently had this conversation at one of the Black comic book conventions, and it was a panel with Damian Duffy and Hannibal Taboo, who was a really talented writer and comics critic. And the theme was talking about kindred, but also talking about time travel and race, right? And so I started thinking about like, well, a lot of these particular time travel narratives, that deal with like race in some way. And I can give you a couple of examples. There's this episode of the X-Files. It's called Red Rum, and it stars like Joe Morton, and it's about a gentleman who gets wrongfully accused of killing his wife, and he gets shot by his stepfather, and no, his father-in-law, and he starts time traveling backwards. And it's all about him, and it has this really like very like Afro-futurist kind of feel to it, you know what I'm saying? Because and everything's about him, but the thing that actually is the kickoff is his potential death, right? He gets to right or wrong, so to speak, right? Kindred, of course, is a great example, but also this episode called Memphis from the 2000s version of like the Twilight Zone, where like Eric LaSalle's character is diagnosed with an incurable disease, and he ends up getting in a car accident, and he time travels to Memphis, back right before Dr. King is assassinated, and he gets a chance to either save this little boy or save Dr. King, right? And so it's like these really interesting ideas around like trauma, race, oppression, like you said, even PTSD too. I could see that being the case. But it just seemed to me to be more than a coincidence, because you have the time travel machine like that H.G. Wells kind of creates with his seminal novel of the same name. He creates that term, right, the time machine. But you don't have a time machine with something like Kindred. You don't really have a time machine with that book by I forget her name, but it's called Stigmata, where like there's a time machine there's a time travel kind of aspect that happens there. There's even time travel in Daws of the Dust, where you actually where like the future spirit of the unborn child is haunting the present. That by itself is an Afrofuturist notion, but it's a time travel story. So I don't know. I think that there's something to be said about like I'm still working through it, this Denia chronosomatic idea, right? That's what I call it, Denia chronosomatic. And I've been thinking about it for a while because I keep seeing it, popping up, in just traditional, more Eurocentric, time travel, but also, especially in time travel stories about Black folk, like Sankofa, the film by, is it Haile Jemima, right? That is a possession narrative, but also a time travel story at the same time, There's also, the work of Rashida Phillips, and More Mother out of like Philadelphia. They created this idea called Black Quantum Futurism, where it's about reclaiming time and about like different modes of time travel and different modes of like healing through rethinking time and the quantum nature of that too. So I don't know. I don't know if I'm answering the question, but I'm just looking at patterns, essentially, and just giving a name to it, because two things is a coincidence and three things I think is a pattern.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a possible arc in what this question is coming at, or comments coming at, is this idea of psychology and wellness through this time travel.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're almost at time. Fantasia, would you like to squeeze in a question or anything like that before we?
I think that I'm sorry that we didn't get to all of the questions. I hope you take a little moment to just look at the comments when you get the chance, Professor Jennings, because there's just like so much love going on. And I think they speak for all of us when I just say thank you so much.
All right. Well, I appreciate that. And again, shout out to my friends at Berkeley, Derek Scott, Michael Cohen, Lee Rayford, Adriana Green, hope to see y'all again soon. So, and hopefully get a chance to meet y'all, in person. I was kind of bummed that we couldn't travel, but stay safe, so, because we got to protect the future, right? So.
Yeah, thank you so much, and being like a true spirit, doing this digitally, kind of like, I guess, feeding into this futuristic world that we're kind of navigating within.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you so much.
Well, I really
very much appreciate it.
Oh yeah, thank you so much for having me. And I'm, again, I'm sorry I had to speed through a section of my talk, but I knew I was overdoing it, but I threw it in there anyway.